All right, well, it's about 7 o'clock, so I guess we'll get going so that we can all go do whatever else we want to do tonight. And I hope that the audio is working all right for everybody joining us on Zoom and YouTube. So we're back for part 3 of our multi-part series. So or I guess 2 weeks ago, we were talking about Noah. So we were placing ourselves in this early parts of Genesis. We're looking at some of the particularly literary evidence that is corresponding with the biblical texts about our mythic past, right? And so we talked about our pre-flood era, our antediluvian times, as being almost this mythical period where people live a really long time and there are special heroes and a different set of affairs. So we're really looking at a different type of time scale. But this week we're going to transition and we're going to start looking at some of our earliest patriarchal figures and our founders of early Judaism. And so this week we want to look at Abraham and Sarah, the sort of first of our patriarchs. And this is going to be interesting for us because Abraham is one of our most well-known biblical figures, right? If we're asking people with very little familiarity with biblical texts, Abraham is one of the people that they will likely know or have heard of. He is the father of our 3 monotheistic or Abrahamic religions, and so plays a central part in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So for all of these religions, he is a central founding figure. So that's obviously going to make him important in a number of different senses. But for us, we have a different question. Right? If we're looking at sort of this broader context of the biblical text, we have to ask ourselves, how should we read and understand the Abrahamic narratives? Are we looking at a biography, right, or an autobiography? Is this history? Is this telling us a story about a person, their actual life, and what they actually did? Is this a legend, a folk tale? Maybe there was a person named Abraham, and some of the things are true, but as we know with folk tales, things grow over time, and we're making moral arguments, we're making cultural arguments, we're making theological arguments, and expanding to include things that may or may not have happened, but that's not important. That's not the point of these stories, right? The point is to pick a figure that existed and then sort of create legends around a important recognized historical figure. Our third option is that there are fictional tales, that there is no Abraham, there doesn't need to be an Abraham, that Abraham is a literary creation that is meant to tell important stories, important cultural truths as a created culture hero of later Israelite populations. So these are some of the questions that we're going to want to look at today. Right? Can we find room for a historical Abraham or a situation for a legendary Abraham, or must we relegate Abraham to a fictional character of later creation? We know from the ancient world that we do have examples of all of these. Right? We have ancient autobiographies. They're usually aggrandized a certain amount to be very positive towards the figures, usually ancient kings that we're talking about. We have legendary figures. A Mesopotamian figure like Gilgamesh, a popular literary figure. Many people think that he exists, that there is a king named Gilgamesh who is a king of Uruk who builds the walls. Anything else we may know about him may be added later. Some of it is very clearly fictionalized or mythical, but a figure actually exists. That's a basis for some of these stories. And we definitely have fictional, mythical tales and figures as well. So is Abraham a historical figure, a literary creation of later scribes, or a mix of both? Let's start out with our chronological setting, right? And so our historical setting is kind of unclear. Abraham lives a long time ago, but not a very long time ago in a far-off distant type place, right? He lives in geographical places that we know of, and in a time that we should be able to identify with. He lives in a time before the emergence of the Israelites and before sort of their rise of the kingdom. And so we might say that his general chronological context is the Bronze Age, which is super broad, right? But if we're thinking about Israel as sort of showing up somewhere around here, right, our late Bronze Iron Age, that he's before this. And if we pay attention to the genealogies and the so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so, and we do some math, he should be hundreds of years, right, before this, which would place him sometime back in here. Our literary context, as we'll find out and explore, is mixed, right? We know that many of the biblical texts are being written here, right, in the Iron Age or the Persian period by our second circle there. And so sometime between, let's say, around 800 and 400 BC is when a lot of these texts are being written. And so some of these texts, when they're written, are preserving or recording much earlier memories, much earlier traditions that have been passed down orally. But we'll find some elements of the story clearly represent the world of the Iron Age, that later circle, our time period in that first millennium BC, whereas some elements might fit better earlier. And we'll try and explore this. Our cultural context is a question. And so if we look at the background, the setting, the activities that Abraham's involved in, are these more reflective of a Bronze Age environment or an Iron Age environment? And that's one of the main questions that we'll be looking to ask. So these are sort of our options, right? A literary creation of the first millennium, a historical or legendary figure of the second or maybe even early third millennium. All right, so first let's think about Abraham and his social setting. What do we know about Abraham? He's a pastoral nomad, right? Abraham does not live in a city. Abraham lives in a tent. He sets up his tent. He has his flocks and herds. He has his immediate family and their various households, which is quite large, but they move around. He's not tied to one place. And so we'll find that once he enters Canaan, he sets up his tent around Shechem. He goes down to Bethel. He goes down to Hebron. He's down in the Negev. He's down to Egypt. He's down to the plain. He moves all over. Right? This is a typical pattern of a pastoral nomad. We can't keep our flocks and herds one place too long. We move around. Pastoral nomadism is a common way that people make a living in the ancient Near East. We know of them. We don't always know a lot about them because they don't tend to write. They don't tend to be kings. They tend to live on the fringes of society with their flocks and herds. When we hear about them, we know that they exist in a number of different periods. Right? So he and his flocks and his herds move around. They live in a tent. But we also know something about the world he lives in. The world he lives in is very rural. Right? When does Abraham go to cities? Doesn't really. Nephew Lot goes down to live in some cities in a valley. He encounters places, right? Places like Shechem, but it doesn't seem to be a big city. People live there in slightly larger numbers. His world is governed by kinship ties. I'm going to talk to families and heads of households and these types of figures, clan governance. There's no state. There's no larger political entity that we encounter. King states, we get them mentioned in one place in Genesis 14, and we'll come back to that. But in general, the world Abraham lives in is not very heavily organized or politically robust, right? So a world of active city-states, this doesn't seem to fit his social setting. And so there's our first clue that maybe not everything is coming from the late period. The world of the Iron Age, when the Bible's being written, is a world of cities. We have a capital in Jerusalem. We have large cities throughout the area. Even in the Persian period, after the exile, the depopulation, we have some major urban centers. Abraham doesn't encounter many urban centers. Right? So if we're writing a story, if I were making up a story, if I'm making up a fictional story in the late Iron Age, why would I create a world that looks very different from my own in some very odd ways? Right? And so in some ways, this then seems like we may predate the period when many of these texts are being written down. We may predate even our Middle Bronze Age, which is a period of urbanism, And so this might put us all the way back into the third millennium. Right? So some people have put Abraham as early as the end of the early Bronze Age. So we'd say around 2000 to 2400 BC. This is a period in the ancient Levant, again, modern day Israel, of ruralization. We have some large cities earlier in the early Bronze Age, but they all collapse for reasons that we're not entirely certain. And we enter what many people consider to be a dark age. Regionalism instead of centralization, a lack of big cities, a return to towns and villages. Most of what we have archaeologically are burial sites. And so people have said, if we have a group of dispersed people, no large urban centers, this sounds kind of like the world of Abraham. We can't prove that. It's a very long time ago. It's a long time for these traditions to be originated, but we can think about what period would this fit. Some people have said the end of the late Bronze Age may be another place that fits, that would be closer to the emergence of Israel. There are some problems there, because even that seems to be more of an urban period. But again, trying to pin down this social setting is one of the questions we have for locating an historical Abraham. We want to think about Abraham as saying, we want to start off with his origins. And so according to our biblical text, the story of Abraham starts with his father Terah, and then his nephew Lot, right? And then so Abraham and Sarai, they go forth and they leave Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Which we have down here in southern Mesopotamia. And they go on a trip. And they go on a trip to Haran. Haran is somewhere up here, right? We can see up on the map in northern Mesopotamia. Right, so that's our first stage, moving out of southern Mesopotamia into northern Mesopotamia. This makes sense, right? If the last thing we talked about was our ancient flood narratives, those were all taking place in a Mesopotamian type setting. So that's where we were. We leave there. Where do we go? Somewhere up north in Aram. And then from there, eventually, we're going down to Canaan. At which point we get our famous passage in Genesis 12, the call of Abraham, Lech Lecha, get up and go, right, to the land that I am going to show you. And so eventually then, Abram is going to take his wife, Lot, his nephew, all their possessions, right, their flocks and herds, and they are going to leave Haran. They're going down to Canaan, and they're going to set up their tent somewhere around Shechem. At this point, according to our text in Genesis, the Canaanites are in the land. Right, so we're not coming into an uninhabited area, but we're not coming into a large urban area either. So this is our first tradition for the origins of Abraham. Abraham comes from vaguely Mesopotamia, but specifically from the north, right? From an area that we are generally going to consider to be Aram in Syria. There's some problems with that. I'll get to those problems later. But we see this tradition in other places. If we go to Deuteronomy 26, right? A wandering Aramean was my father. Right, this idea that our ancestors, that Abraham is from the area of Aram and is a pastoral nomad wandering around with his flocks and herds. Right, so these are one of our traditions of our origins. Remember this, we'll come back to it. It's not without our problems, but this is what we're looking at, right? Migrants coming from the north. Well, this seems like something that we might want to investigate. Do we have evidence of people, pastoral nomads maybe, coming from the north, coming from an area of either southern Mesopotamia or Aram, northern Syria, coming down into Canaan? In fact, we do. Right? We have a couple instances of this happening, sort of. The first one is going to be in the late early Bronze Age. That's our first circle there, which is the Kura-Araxes migration. And the second one is going to be an Amorite wave or Amorite invasion that I have conveniently and purposefully in quotes, happening in the Middle Bronze Age. So we want to look at those a little bit more closely and say, can we relate these to the Abrahamic narrative? The answer is going to be it's difficult. The first one is the Kura-Araxes migration. And so the Kura-Araxes is a culture that is coming from the Caucasus. They originate somewhere up in here, right? Modern day sort of Armenia. And at some point, they spread in Anatolia. And by 2600 BC, mid-third millennium, they make it down into the Levant. And you can see here, particularly in the north. We can recognize them by distinctive types of pottery that they make. That's what we call it a culture. An archaeological culture is marked by material culture differences. And they make this fun, shiny black and red pottery that we call Khirbet Kerak ware because it's found at a site called Beit Yerak or Khirbet Kerak in northern Israel. So it's showing that there are people migrating down. When we find this pottery, it's not actually being brought with by traders, it's being made locally. So we have local craftsmen who are migrating. So it's a sign of migration, not just economic connections with somewhere in the north. We do have some problems. If you look at this map, you can even see that Haran, our Habur triangle, right, is up here. The Kura-Axis culture is further north. It doesn't really fit with our origins of Abraham. It's much more centered in Armenia. Certainly doesn't fit with southern Mesopotamia, right? This is a different type of origins for Abraham's family, and so it doesn't quite fit that way. We also see that the Abrahamic traditions are very southern based. He sets up in Shechem and he moves south. He's in Beersheba, he's in Hebron, he's not in the Galilee. And if we look at the Khirbet Kerak ware and the Kura-Axis culture, it's all in the north. Right, it's at Beit Yerak, it's up north of there. It doesn't make its way far south. And so the culture that we're exploring that seems to be from migrants is coming in a geographic location that doesn't fit well with the nexus for the Abrahamic stories. Our third problem is it's happening early. So in the early Bronze Age 3 period. Remember I said the early Bronze Age 4 period, around 2400 to 2000, is a time of ruralization that might fit the Abrahamic narratives. The early Bronze Age 3 is a major urban period. And so big cities, large population centers that may not fit well with the Abrahamic story. So the Kura-Axis shows that groups are migrating from the north down, but don't quite fit well with the Abrahamic narratives. Second circle I showed you, sometime around 2000 to 1800-ish, is our Amorite wave, sometimes considered an Amorite invasion. The Amorites are a different group we can look at. And so the Amorites are a West Semitic people. West Semitic is going to include language and culture groups that include eventually Hebrew, Aramaean, other types of things that are generally Western-based as opposed to Akkadian, Mesopotamian, Eastern-based. So they are Western Semitic people, and they show up in Akkadian texts starting in the third millennium, labeled as the Amuru. Amuru is just our Akkadian term for Western. So they're the Westerners. They don't like the Westerners very much. Our Sumerian term for them is the Martu, but the Amuru are, well, they're shepherds, they're pastoral nomads, and we have tension in the ancient world between people who live in cities and people who don't. And there are people who don't. And our people in cities have strong beliefs in things like, oh, I don't know, personal property that is mine and walls and property boundaries. And nomads with their flocks and herds don't, right? And so there's tensions between the different groups. So a lot of what we hear about the Amuru is bad. But they keep showing up, and there's a lot of them. And they keep showing up, and eventually they end up establishing a number of kingdoms all across Mesopotamia. In fact, some of the ones that you may be more familiar with, Mesopotamian kingdoms, are Amorite kingdoms. Most famously, the Old Babylonian Empire under the ruler of Hammurabi, composer, sponsor of the famous Law Code. He's an Amorite king of an Amorite dynasty that takes over Babylon. Eventually, the Amorites show up also in the southern Levant. Sometime in the early Middle Bronze Age, end of the early Bronze Age, they show up there. And we can tell they show up there because we start seeing new forms of archaeological evidence that we haven't seen before. I'll look at them in another slide. Next slide. How they get there is another question. Kathleen Kenyon, one of our early archaeologists, suggests an invasion, right? That they come in, nomadic warriors, sweeping in, taking over from a previous group and setting up their cities. We haven't really found evidence of this level of migration, certainly not this level of violence. The military hypothesis has largely been discarded. There's a hypothesis of economic colonization, where basically they're migrant traders that slowly infiltrate into new areas and sort of set up shop, don't leave, stick around. The process in the southern Levant is the same as Mesopotamia. They're herders and traders and sometimes military people who just kind of move around and eventually stick around. Right? So a lot of different ways in which these people may be coming. But our Amorites, we know, are from west of Mesopotamia proper, that's west of Babylon, and north of Canaan. Well, that fits somewhat well with Aram, right? West, they'd be considered Westerners from a Babylonian perspective. They'd be considered Northerners from a Canaanite perspective. And so the general area and pastoral nomads, that there are some things about the Amorites that fit with some of the lifestyle of Abraham. We have problems here too. Right? By the end of the Middle Bronze Age, Amorite kingdoms control almost the entirety of the Levant. So we know these migrations are happening, but what they're doing in Israel is they're setting up giant cities and kingdoms. Half the way we identify them is giant ramparts, big gates, massive mud brick structures. This is not what Abraham's doing. He's going around with flocks and herds. So in this sense, the Amorites seem somewhat odd, right? They're noted for fortifications, defensive structures, social complexity, setting up kingdoms with kings. This doesn't sound like Abraham. We have a lot of personal names of Amorites, which is how we identify them in texts. And Abraham isn't really an Amorite name either. So there are some issues where the West and the North and the geography kind of fit. The fact that some of these Amorites are pastoral fit. The ones that are coming down to Canaan don't necessarily seem like Abraham. Right, so these are the kingdoms they're establishing. Babylonia, Mari, Katna, Yamhad, centered around Hatzor in northern Israel would be another one. Ugarit along the coast would be another one. But they establish a number of kingdoms. Well, their major centers is at Mari. Mari is sort of along the city along the Euphrates. It's a very important kingdom. It's a very large one. It's a rival of Hammurabi's Babylon. It is a home to a massive archive from the early second millennium, around 1700 BC. This archive, though, explains that we have an Amorite kingdom ruled by Amorite kings. You know what their biggest problem is? Other Amorites who are nomads, who don't live in the city, who are on the outskirts and cause them problems. We actually have evidence of a lot of tribal groups in the area. The sons of the south, the sons of the north, the various different groups that are organized, and we have tribal politics in the region. So while some of our Amorites are setting up kingdoms, other Amorites are wandering around as family-based clans and tribal nomads. So we may not need to dismiss just because some of our Amorites are setting up cities that others of them are not, but certainly to think that a major wave is coming down. We don't need to put Abraham as part of that. If we believe our stories, it doesn't say Abraham and everyone around him in a giant group went and migrated to Canaan. Right? It seems like Abraham is kind of acting a little bit rogue and is a part of a much small, not part of a large mass migration. Abraham is one guy with his family and stuff who decide to go move on. And the problem with us for that is that's not what archaeologists find. We don't find one family who doesn't build a house, who moves around a lot with a bunch of non-perishable items. This is not the type of thing we find well in the archaeological record. It's not what we're good at finding. And so a figure like Abraham is not someone we would expect to find many remains of. People like Abraham are not the type of people we can track. We have some textual evidence they exist. There's some really good archaeological work being done to try and trace temporary settlements of nomads, but these are not easy people to trace. So everything we know about Abraham says ghost, right? And so when we go try and finding him, we shouldn't be surprised when we get ghosted. So this is a sort of our Amorite world. So we have evidence of people migrating from the north to areas of Canaan. We have problems saying this is an easy identification for what Abraham is doing. I want to turn our attention, though, to one of these Amorite kingdoms. I want to turn our attention to one of these Amorite kingdoms named Ugarit. You can see here on the map, it is on the Mediterranean coast in the north, in modern day, sort of on the Syria-Turkey border. It is the ancient site of Ras Shamra. It is a massive city-state in the late Bronze Age, so around it's destroyed in the 12th century, but we're looking at the 12th to 14th century. It is, and I have this intentionally in quotations, a Canaanite city-state. They're not Canaanite. They actually make it quite clear that they don't identify as Canaanite. When we start looking at them, boy, do they look Canaanite to us. So we think I'm going to give you an imperfect illusion here. People in the future come and do some excavation. And they know of a general society called American. And then they do some excavation, but most of the information they have is coming from a city in Canada, right? They're definitely not American. They would hate that you would call them American, but culturally, they look pretty similar, right? Material culturally, general background, general tradition, that our Canadians look in many ways. There's some key differences, but culturally have a lot of similarities with our Americans. And so the Ugarit are the Canadians of Canaan. Right? They're further to the north. They are clearly slightly different in ways that we don't entirely understand. But when we talk about Canaanite culture, we use Ugarit as a major example. And there are reasons we do it. So their religion, their cult, their tradition share a lot of similarities with what we know of Canaan and Canaanite traditions as mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. This is important because whereas much of Canaan at this point is minimally literate, not much writing going on, mostly diplomatic, mostly for foreigners. We have a massive set of documents, written documents from Ugarit, written in Ugaritic, an alphabetic form of cuneiform that you can see on one of these tablets down here. And as part of the massive amount of documentation we have a set of myths and legends telling stories about forefathers, patriarchal heroes of the Canaanites. Right? And so again, if our Abraham, we were looking at a setting perhaps in that middle or early Bronze Age. We're looking at our literary setting up here in the Iron Age. There's Ugarit, right? Smack dab in the middle, sometime in the late Bronze Age. And they have patriarchal epics. And I will look at two of those epics today. First one is the tale of Akkad. It's not really a story about Akkad. Story about his father. Patriarchal hero by the name of Dan-el. Right? And Dan-el has a problem. He is a patriarch. He is a pious person, beloved of the gods, and he has no children. He has no progeny to follow him up, to do the duties of a son, to take care of him in his old age, to carry on his name, to inherit his household. This story should sound familiar to us, right? What is our problem that Abraham is dealing with throughout our early things? Is that Abraham and Sarah have no children and are getting too old for it. So what does Dan-el do? He appeals to the gods. He appeals to the gods. He makes offerings. He makes sacrifices. Over the course of days, he lays out his cloak in a holy place. He leaves offerings to the gods. He waits for a message. He finally gets solicitation from his gods. We're in a Canaanite pantheon. He has multiple gods. His main ones are Baal and El. El is our father god. El is in charge of this type of thing. And El hears and says, I like this guy, Dan-el. He's a good dude. He should have a kid. right? And so he grants his request. The wife conceives and gives birth to a son named Akat. The gods then come to visit the child. Hooray, you have a child. We are going to bring presents. The craftsman god, the wise craftsman gods craft a special composite bow for him. And they give it to Donnell to give to Akat. When they come, the gods are walking in with their gifts. Donnell sees them coming from afar. He goes to his wife, Anatia, and says, quick, they're coming. We must be hospitable. Make a feast. Make some cake. Sacrifice an animal. Make a feast. Let's be hospitable. This sounds familiar. We might think of Genesis 18, when God and probably some angels visit Abraham and at this point are foretelling the birth of Isaac, at which point Sarah is in the tent giggling, apparently, right? And not believing it in her old age. But this idea of hospitality, that the gods are people that are walking among us, they may visit us, we can be hospitable, right? This sort of a legendary setting sounds very Abrahamic. At this point, our story is going to diverge in different directions. Akat is going to take the bow. A different goddess is going to say, I want your bow, give it to me. He's going to insult her. She's going to hire an assassin to kill him. The text gets very broken. Apparently, all the vegetation dies. Donnell's going to bring it back, and somehow his sister is going to get revenge. I don't know how it all works. The text's fairly broken. It's not as relevant to us. The first part that I've outlined here is the part that's relevant, right? Stories of patriarchs with special relationships with God who are very personal, very interactive, concerned with questions like progeny. Abraham fits into a Bronze Age setting of legendary culture, patriarchal heroes. I have another story. There's Elle, by the way, sitting being cool. There's a story of a king named Kirta or Carrot in certain editions, depending how you put in the vowels, right? And Carrot has a problem. Carrot can have lots of children, but they all die. He can't keep them alive. They keep getting sick, dying, bad things happening to them. And so he needs children. So he also has a problem of progeny. Not that they can't conceive and birth them, but he still has the same concerns of, I have no offspring to do what I need. And he is also going to get a visitation from the gods in a dream. Elle is going to show up. Elle is going to say, I know your problem. You don't have the right wife. You need an auspicious wife to have good children. I know where one is. You need to go find the right wife, marry her, and start a new family. Concerns about finding the right wife to ensure the viability of the family line sound very much like some of our Abrahamic stories. Let's go find the right wife to do what we want to do for the good of the family. So concerns of progeny, close relationships with the gods, talking to them in dreams. He has many children then, 8. He fails to fulfill a vow that he makes, if you give me successful children, I will offer sacrifices. He forgets because he's so excited having so many children, at which point he is struck with a fatal illness. He gets sick, the land gets sick. Eventually he's healed by Elle. So Elle as a figure that is granting healing, a figure that's granting children. Eventually his oldest children try and overthrow him. He has to elevate the younger children. His youngest daughter, the 8th, and her older brother, the 7th, are elevated. Elevation of younger siblings. That sounds like something we may know from some of our biblical texts, right? Disfavoring older siblings, Jacob and Esau, right, would be an example of that. Joseph's elevation in those narratives. You could even argue an Isaac over Ishmael elevation in the Hebrew Bible, although that's got some favorite wife play going on. But again, this is elevation of the younger children, treachery going on. So some other ideas here. So this says that we have legendary tales from the late Bronze Age, from the Canaanite world, that are concerned with the same things Abraham's concerned about, that live lives similar to what Abraham is living, that show a legendary literary context that is plausible for oral stories of cultural patriarchs in a Bronze Age setting in Canaan. And in fact, our biblical authors seem to know some of these Bronze Age stories. Remember that our hero Don-El, this is the hero of our Akkad text, he's mentioned in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel twice. All right, he's two various passages in Ezekiel 14, even though these three men, Noah, we remember Noah, Don-El, very confusing until we found the Ugaritic texts. A lot of biblical commentaries will say it's sort of a prophetic reference to Daniel, but he's not around yet by the time of Ezekiel, right? And Job, right, our famous sufferer, were innocent, covered by their own righteousness. They could only deliver themselves from your wickedness. So recognized as a righteous person from the ancient past. Ezekiel 28, behold, you are no wiser than Don-El. There is no secret that is a match for you. Wiser than Don-El. So again, ancient sage. So this is showing that at the time of Ezekiel, which is a time when our biblical texts are probably being written, right, sometime around this 7th, 6th, 5th century, we still have a familiarity with Canaanite cultural heroes. And so some of these tales are being preserved in different types of ways. And so thinking about the Abrahamic tales being preserved orally and passed down through this time period is also plausible. Right? We talked about our common themes: head of household with special relationship to the deity, close contact between the patriarch and deity, concern for progeny, perpetuation of the family line. This is going to bring us back to another issue that we have here, which is our key feature in Genesis and Abraham is Abraham's relationship with God. Our question is then, which God? And Abraham worships, depending sort of what version of the text we're reading, but he worships a God named El. In Genesis 15, we have an El Most High, El Elyon. Genesis 17, we have El the Almighty, El Shaddai. Genesis 21, we have an El Olam, El the Eternal. Now we have a complication here that I'm not telling you on the slide, which is El is both the proper name of a deity who is the head of the Canaanite pantheon and a generic term for God. So if you're reading a translation of the Hebrew text, it will not say El Most High, it will say God Most High. The word is El. It could be a generic term for God. It can be a proper name. We have reason to believe that for Abraham, it's a proper name. The Bible tells us. We can turn to Exodus 6. God is appearing to Moses, saying, go save my people from Egypt. And Moses is saying, not it. Find somebody else. Right? The people are not going to believe me. He's like, how do I know who's sending me? Right? These types of things. So God speaks to Moses and says, I am the Lord, using the proper name of God. Right? I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Almighty, El Shaddai. But I used a different name in the past. I did not reveal my true name to them. I used a different one. But by my name, the Lord, my proper name, I did not make myself known to them. Right? So the suggestion here in Exodus 6 is that Abraham doesn't know God's proper name. He knows God as a version of El, that he exclusively worships. Right? We can still have a monotheistic understanding of this is my God, but he's not calling God by the proper name, right, assigned here as the Lord. He's calling him by El the Almighty, El the Most High. And so understands God as a version of El. So when we know that our ancestors were worshiping El, we can say, through syncretism, same God we worship now. Genesis 6 says that. Same God. But Abraham is worshiping probably a God named El, who's the same God being worshipped by Dan-El, Kirta are other Canaanite figures. Right? He's a well-known god in Canaanite myth and epic. He's a patron deity of these figures, often referred to as Father El or Bull El. If you're thinking about later why when they're leaving Egypt, they're setting up a giant golden calf, or when in the northern kingdom they say, we are going to go worship God and building giant calf structures. What has happened? I have lost my screens. System will shut down in 5 minutes unless I postpone. I'm going to postpone. Please wait for system to shut down. I don't like that. Now I'm waiting for it to warm up. The gods have decided against my blasphemy, and I'm suffering the consequences through technology that is not quite showing on the screen. And here we are, but we are going to go back to this one, and we're going to go back to this one. All right, and we are back on. Apologies for the interruption. But we have this bull as a reference. And so this idea of a bull as a symbol of religion that we see carried over into early Israelite practice, although not condoned by our prophets and our official sanctioning. In fact, we find a lot of religious practice not condoned by our later sanctioning, right? Open-air cult sites seem to be common in our tales of Abraham. What does he do? He moves his tent. He came and dwells by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Oaks of Mamre may sound like a sort of place name, but it's probably a sacred grove, a sacred set of trees, right? Building an altar, we also might think of erecting standing stones. Here's some standing stones on a site called Gezer from Israel. Here we have a motif on Canaanite pottery called the sacred tree. We have 2 goats and we have a big tree in the middle. And this sacred tree tradition is important in illustrations on Bronze Age pottery. So our idea of standing stones of sacred trees is common in Canaanite religion and appears to be part of the Abrahamic tradition. I wander around, I build an altar, I erect a monument, I'm by these trees, sacred groves. His practice fits the practice of Bronze Age Canaanites, which are not things he would be doing if I entirely wrote this in our much more monotheistic later Israelite tradition. The Abrahamic stories have some religious practices that are kind of need to be swept under the rug a little bit for our later purer monotheists. Not that Abraham should know any better. There's no center of Jerusalem to worship in. There's no Mosaic law. All he has to do is pay attention to one God, which he apparently does, whose name is El. So the processes that he does to speak with these gods also fit a setting. One of these practices is incubation. Incubation is a specific ritual in the ancient world where if I want to talk to a deity, they talk through dreams. And so what I need to do is go sleep in the right place, a holy place, and do the right rituals beforehand. And then the gods will talk to me. It's a widespread practice, reaching from early Sumerian period all the way to later Greek traditions. Right, so there's a fairly wide distribution, but it's a way of soliciting a message from the gods, right? And so I'm going to sleep in a holy place. Genesis 15, when Abraham is promised an heir, he meets with God, he sets up various rituals and falls into a deep sleep, and God talks to him. Genesis 28, Jacob arrives at a certain place, puts his head on a certain stone, and has a dream where he sees his heavenly beings going up and down a ladder that we argued last week. Sounds like very much like a temple tower, right, in a Mesopotamian tradition, and gets a message. I'm the God of your fathers, I'll be your God, right? Important renewal of the covenant. Kirta, when he wants a son, goes to a special alcove in his house, probably a cultic corner. Sleep overcomes him. El visits him and promises him progeny. Dan-El has a ritual over 7 days, lays out his cloak, makes an offering, spends the night. He eventually is visited by Baal in a dream, telling him he will support his claim before El. Right, so we have a tradition, and this tradition, again, is widespread chronologically and geographically, but we can see here elements of an ancient culture of God theophany appearing in dreams, which can be solicited through going to sleep in the right time, in the right place, and doing the right things. We also see some odd rituals. Right, perhaps one of the oddest ones in our Abrahamic narratives is Genesis 15. An odd passage. It's a ritual passage. God is making promises, making his covenant with Abraham, so it's very important. But at this point, he makes some odd requests. God says to Abraham, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, 3-year-old female goat, 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought all this to them. He cut them in two, laid each half opposite the other, except the birds. Came dark, sun had set, it was very dark. There appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between the pieces. Then the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, making various types of promises. Right? What is going on here? Some sort of weird ritual. But you know what? It's a weird ritual that has certain parallels, not exact parallels, but there's a ritual text from the Hittites. From between 1400 and 1200 BC, Hittites are located modern-day Turkey, Anatolia. And this is a purification ceremony in case of military defeat. So obviously the context is different. Abraham has had no military defeat. A purification ritual, though? Possibly, right? We might need purification to come in contact with a deity. But here we have a bunch of ritually slaughtered animals that are halved, and people pass between them while fires are burned at gates on either end of the severed animals. The animals are different. They sever a human. We have human sacrifice in here. A billy goat, a puppy, and a piglet. We have no sacrifice of puppies or piglets in the context of the Hebrew world. They're not appropriate ones, right? So some differences, but this idea of split animals, burning torches, passing between them, there's some kind of common ritual that I'm not saying these are the same, but there's a world in which these are part of a ritual tradition that makes sense in a Bronze Age context. And so even though we may have no direct relationship between these, there's some conceptual shared background that can help us say, okay, Abraham's doing something here that somebody at the time reading it kind of knows what this is, right? Has some kind of familiarity with. We have other practices. One of the signs of the covenant is circumcision. Who came up with that idea? Is a question you might be thinking about, right? That you shall keep my covenant, your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Flesh of your foreskin shall be the sign of the covenant, 8 days old throughout the generations. Hebrew Bible doesn't make up circumcision. It's a known practice. Here I have a fun wall relief from the mastaba tomb of Akmahor from Dynasty 6 Saqqara. 2330 to 2350 BC, very old, right? Predates most of our Bronze Age traditions. This is Old Kingdom Egypt. This is 3rd millennium. What do I have? Some kids getting themselves circumcised with flint knives. This is what we're using, stone knives. I can't imagine how that feels. Anyway, this happening as a tradition in Egypt. Right, so Egypt has a tradition of circumcision. The Canaanites apparently don't. Right, so there's going to be separate from the Canaanite population, but not an unknown procedure. Right, it's not that God says, I want you to circumcise, and somebody says, wait, what? What's circumcision? Right, this is a known procedure. Why it's happening, less clear in Egyptian context, right? Why they're doing this. We don't have an explanation text here of what's going on, but we know the practice. We have visual evidence of the practice. So some traditions seem kind of early and fit with a Bronze Age Canaanite structure. Some traditions are clearly later. Here we'll look at a term, anachronism. Anachronisms are chronological inconsistencies, things that are located in a time period where it doesn't or shouldn't exist. And the Abrahamic stories are full of anachronisms that fit okay in an Iron Age world or a Persian world, but don't fit in a Bronze Age world. First one is his homeland. Where does Abraham come from? Ur of the Chaldeans. Sounds straightforward. It's not. The Chaldeans are an Aramaic-speaking tribe. They are not native to the area of Ur. We actually have no reference of them before the 9th century. 878 is the first text with reference to the Chaldeans. The Babylonian ruling dynasty in the Neo-Babylonian period, at the time of the Jewish exile in the 6th century, under Nebuchadnezzar, is a Chaldean dynasty. At the time of Abraham, there are no Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia that we know of. In fact, our Aramaeans, my father was a wandering Aramaean. They're West Semitic-speaking people. Our first references to them as a tribe, only around 1100, right, in northern Syria. And so this whole, I'm going to go send people back up to Aram to go find a wife for Isaac, I'm going to send Jacob back up to the relatives, the Aramaeans, doesn't fit as well in a Bronze Age context. There are Aramaeans up there in the Iron Age. Camels. Abraham is a very successful herdsman. He has massive flocks. He has goats, sheep, cattle, and tons of camels. And in fact, the Pharaoh gives him gifts of more camels. We have camels playing an important role in getting Isaac a wife. Who's going to give water to my camels? Well, the answer is nobody, because they're not domesticated yet. Certainly not the dromedary. But the dromedary is domesticated at the earliest, mid to late 2nd millennium in the Arabian Peninsula. Our earliest evidence of domesticated dromedary bones in Palestine show up between 1200, 1100, early Iron Age at the earliest. And some of those are still possibly wild. It's kind of hard to, small wild ones, big domestic ones. There's some questions there. By the time we're hitting the 9th, 8th century, we're riding them around in Assyrian wall reliefs, right? We're running away on camels. They're all over the place. So in a later text, of course there are camels around. But if you're actually in a Bronze Age tradition, donkeys. That's how I get everything everywhere. I don't have camels. There are no camels. I mean, there are camels. I'm eating them. There are 2-humped camels if I'm in Iran, but I'm not in Iran. I'm in southern Levant. Right? And so again, here's potential early setting for Abraham. Here's some of our Canaanite texts. Here's our potential time of writing. Aramaeans in Syria, domesticated camels, Chaldeans in Babylonia, arrival of Philistines I'll talk about, all happening in this period here. Right? So the setting we're describing in some ways is more early to mid Iron Age. Right? Abraham, where does he go? Various times. He's sojourning around. He at some point wanders around, goes to Beersheba, and he goes make some treaties and ends up staying in the land of the Philistines, the land of Gerar. Cool. We know the land of the Philistines is the coastal plain. Except not for Abraham. You know why? There are no Philistines. Philistines are a group of people of Aegean origin. They're forced out of the Aegean area for reasons that are not entirely clear in the collapse of the late Bronze Age, somewhere around 1200 to 1175. They migrate. They settle along the coast. They have some fights with Egypt. They are, again, of this Aegean Greek type origin. They are very distinctive. We can tell them archaeologically. We can identify when they show up, and it's in the early Iron Age. So if Abraham is a Bronze Age tradition, there are no Philistines for him to meet. They do not exist in this area. There are Canaanites playing Egyptian in that region at the time. Our entire chapter of Genesis 14 seems odd. Genesis 14 tells the story of Abraham and his unfortunate nephew Lot, who's living in the city of Sodom at the time, which is conquered by a group of kings. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, other kings, go down and they attack. 12 years these kings had served Kedorlaomer. In the 13th year, they rebelled. This sounds like the world of the Neo-Assyrians. We have no evidence of any Mesopotamian king from the second millennium having vassals paying tribute at anywhere close to this distance. Right? Shinar we know is Babylon. Elam is Iran. Right? They're well-known large political entities, but they're not coming this far. The idea of serving a king for 13 years, denying tribute, having them come to make you pay for it, this is the world of the 8th century. This is the world of the 7th century. This is the world of Assyria and Babylon. This is not the world of the second millennium Bronze Age. Right, so this entire story sounds like it fits a context of a later period. Finding of Isaac. Probably our most well-known story of Abraham, right, in the Abraham cycle. Abraham is called by God to offer his son Isaac as a human sacrifice. What should we make of this story? It's used as a classic example of Abraham demonstrating his faith. But I'm willing to give up the one thing I always wanted to God because God told me to do it. It's a sign of Abraham's faith. But we're also sitting here and saying, God says, Abraham, sacrifice your son. And Abraham's like, cool, gonna go do it. Let's go find some wood and altar. You're like, wait, what? Right? What's our context of this type of tradition? Right? And so do we have a context of child sacrifice? And the answer is sort of. Right? It's not super well attested. Right? We don't have tons of examples of child sacrifice generally. It's mentioned certain times in the Bible. And the Judges, one of our leaders, Jephthah, makes a vow to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house. Note that you don't have pets. He doesn't expect a puppy to come walking out. He knows it's a person. It happens to be his daughter. He sacrifices her to fulfill the vow. We have a story in 2 Kings where the Moabite king, the Israelites are attacking. The Moabite king says, I'm going to lose. I must make a drastic sign to my gods, takes his son, who's going to succeed him as king, and sacrifices him on the city wall. We have a few stories of some Israelite kings who are supposedly sacrificing their sons in these various Tophets surrounding Jerusalem in the later Iron Age. Best example we know of this practice is Phoenician. The Phoenicians, who are sort of the inheritors of the Canaanite world and sort of related to them, they have a practice of child sacrifice. Our best known examples come from the Tophet at Carthage, which is a sacred precinct for the goddess Tanit. And apparently, when you need something very badly, you say, if the gods help me, I make a vow, I will sacrifice a child. And we have funerary urns with remains of children. And we have funerary stela, votive stela, that say this is the vow that was fulfilled, that this child is an offering in response to. So we have a tradition, but that tradition is later. That's an Iron Age tradition. Right? That's an 8th century, 10th century, Carthage is sort of 10th to 8th, but all the way down to the 5th century. But it's a later Iron Age tradition, one that may be inherited from Bronze Age Canaan, but we have no real evidence of that. We don't have good evidence of an earlier tradition of it. So is this rooted in practices of child sacrifice? Not clear. Right? And we certainly have a theological other background for this story. All right, so what can we conclude from this? Unearthing Abraham is hard, right? He's a type of figure that's hard to identify in archaeology and ancient texts. Our political accounts of wars and battles and encounters wouldn't really care much about a pastoral nomad, even a very important one with a nice family. From a literary perspective, our stories include elements that seem to fit with Bronze Age Canaanite literary traditions, but also some elements that seem to clearly come from later hands and edits and thoughts. Right? Part of the setting and the narrative are more at home in Bronze Age parts of the history. Parts of them seem to be more at home in later periods. But we do have thematic elements and continuity with Canaanite culture that suggest at least part of the Abrahamic narratives are old, right? That they are not just later fabrications, that we can think about Abraham as sort of a legendary figure that is based on oral tales that have passed down over time, but also not unmodified, right? That have been modified for theological, cultural type purposes as they have been written down. So again, a complicated figure with a complicated literary, historical, and cultural past. Thank you very much.